Hare Krishna, everyone. Welcome to another interview on Books Are the Basis, the importance of reading Srila Prabhupada's books. My name is Krishna Prabhupada. I'm serving here at ISKCON Zurich, and we are conducting this interview on behalf of the ISKCON Ministry of Education, trying to encourage and inspire devotees to read more often in Srila Prabhupada's books. And we are very happy and honored to have today with us His Grace Suresvara Prabhu. Hare Krishna Prabhu.
Hare Krishna, Krishna Prabhu. So good to be here. Thank you.
Thank you for accepting our invitation. Suresvara Prabhu has joined the Hare Krishna movement very early in the 1970, so just when ISKCON was started, and received first and second initiation in 71, 72, while serving at New Vrindavan. And during his devotional career in his life, he was always, like Srila Prabhupada's books always was a center in his life, served in the BBT, wrote articles for the Back to Godhead. And also, personally, we got to know each other. I remember when you came to Zurich, this was, I think, in around 2012, you started to travel around the world to give the seminars on Srila Prabhupada, our founder Acharya, helping devotees to appreciate and understand the importance of Srila Prabhupada's position. And in 2014, at the request of some of your senior God brothers, also you accepted the service being as an initiating spiritual master. So wonderful to have you here. It's always amazing to associate with devotees who have been around for so many years and have so much experience. So looking forward to hear from you. And yeah, we can start with, usually we'd like to hear how you come in touch with Srila Prabhupada's books. So what was going on in your life when you first read a book by Srila Prabhupada?
Yeah. Well, I was one of those counterculture guys who, in America, I chose to leave America in 1970 because we were protesting the Vietnam War. So I went to Toronto, Canada, and it was in Toronto, Canada that I met 10,000 other fellow Americans protesting the war. And, we were young, we didn't have any means. A lot of us had dropped out of school or dropped out of work. It was the dropout culture. So we were hungry. We weren't working. There was a recession on throughout North America, Canada, and the US. So I was rooming with a fellow from Minnesota. There was a place where we could go and they would fix us up with places to stay. And then during the day, there were soup kitchens where we could get something to eat. So one Sunday, my roommate said to me, "Oh, I know where we can eat today. It's Sunday, and the Hare Krishnas have a free feast." So it's an old story to us now, the Sunday feast, but I didn't know what Hare Krishna was or what the Sunday feast was. All I know that it was free food. Our secret weapon, right, as Prabhupada said. So I went with my friend down to the temple. I still remember it, 40 Beverly Street, when I was presenting the Founder Acharya seminars in Toronto a couple of summers ago. Just for fun, I went down as a kind of pilgrimage to 40 Beverly Street, the original temple. It was still there, not as a temple, but it was still there. And anyway, I had this amazing experience when although I didn't know anything about Krishna consciousness or devotees or the temple, immediately, even as I approached the building, everything started to feel familiar, like I was coming home. And then I walked into the temple and the first thing I saw was a picture of one of those old Indian prints of Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu on a wall, and long hair, so it was pre-sannyas, and he was chanting and dancing on the road with villagers in the background. And that looked familiar. Like I kind of knew that. And because we were coming from the counterculture too, chanting and dancing on the road, we were already chanting and dancing in the streets, singing and dancing in the streets. We would protest. So to see a long-haired person singing and dancing on the footpath was not so unfamiliar. In many ways, Mahaprabhu kind of looked like the ultimate hippie, just because he had long robes on, and we would dress kind of outlandishly and long hair. And then I went into that was in the vestibule. And then I went into the temple room. And then the next picture I saw was a picture of Srila Prabhupada, whom I had never seen or heard of. But his face looked even more familiar, which is kind of interesting because Prabhupada, of course, by then, 1970, he was 73, 74 years old. So how could I have seen or known him? I don't know. But his demeanor, his expression looked even more familiar. And then we sat down and we heard a talk by the 21-year-old temple president named Jagadish Prabhu, who was a former minister of education in ISKCON in the 70s, the first one. I was very impressed. And his young wife, Lakshmi Moni, whom we know now, so many years later, was pregnant with her first child. And she was doing something which I couldn't understand. She was flicking sticks at some colored lights. And now I know she was doing arti. And then someone was singing. Now, here's the most familiar thing. The person was singing Hare Krishna. And that was totally familiar. It struck a primeval chord, and it just took me a few seconds to pick up the mantra, because that was my first inner reaction when I heard it. I said, I know this. I know this mantra. So I picked it up, and it was just wonderful singing Hare Krishna. So the whole experience was like a coming home. And then, of course, the Sunday feast was, as they say in real estate, it closed the deal, right? As soon as I tasted prasadam, we're out of this world. I remember sitting down, and I was reading a book. Someone had given me a little book. It was Easy Journey to Other Planets. And so I was reading that book, and that book was blowing my mind. Anti-material worlds, anti-material particle, anti-material vehicles. And then, so I had that book in my right hand, or left hand. No, right hand. And in the left hand, I didn't know you weren't supposed to eat with your left hand. So I was sipping a cup of sweet rice. So those are my Vartma Pradarshaka gurus. Easy Journey and sweet rice.
That was the first book that you read, the Easy Journey.
First, yeah, because I was just skimming it, but it was blowing my mind, and I was thinking, boy, if there's even a possibility that any of this is true, I've got to pursue this. So then Jagadish Prabhu came up to me after the feast, and he said, "Well, what do you think?" I said, "Well, I don't know what, this is all very familiar to me. I feel like I'm home." And I was a seeker. I was looking for truth. I had dropped in and out of university 3 times. And I would just drop back in, because as soon as you dropped out, you became eligible to go fight in Vietnam. So we wanted no part of that. So finally, after dropping out for the 3rd time in December 69, I made a vow that I was just going to find the truth and not worry about what would happen to me, because I knew, I sensed that somebody up there was watching over me. So I said, it's amazing when I'm reading, but is any of this true? So he smiled and he said, "You need to read this." And then he handed me the original heavily abridged Macmillan edition of the Gita before we had the rights, with the black Vishnu silhouette and the purple cover. So I said, "Oh, thank you very much." And I gave him some money. And And then I went back to my room, and I just devoured it. In a few days, I just devoured this. And it wasn't as big as today's Gita. It was just a heavily, Macmillan insisted that Swamiji, as they call Prabhupada, cut it down, to about 1/3 the size, because Prabhupada had a 1,000-page manuscript. So they were so afraid it wouldn't sell. So I read it, and as, imperfectly published as it was, with, only 1/3 of the purports. Some of the purports were matched to the wrong verses, but still, it was so amazing that I thought, wow, this is it. This is the absolute truth. So that's how the book affected me. And I actually had a kind of, because I had been in existential crisis. I was becoming so strangled by the contradictions of life. Everything was absurd, like the existentialists say. Nothing made any sense. There appeared to be as many reasons to not do something as to do something. Everything was duality. So nothing made sense. But then when I read the Gita, and because I felt philosophically kind of strangled, I was actually developing psychosomatic symptoms of strangulation. I was actually feeling constricted in my chest. And so it was getting serious, my philosophical crisis, existential crisis, was manifesting physically. But then when I read Prabhupada's Gita, even though I couldn't understand exactly what was going on, I picked up enough of the gist of it, the oneness and the difference of it all, Jincha Beta Beta Tattva, the 9th chapter especially, most confidential knowledge, how Krishna he's everywhere, but yet he's somewhere. He's all pervading, but he's also a person. That made sense. That the creation is inconceivably and simultaneously one with and yet different from its source. So, wow. And I actually experienced, like, if you've ever gone to a chiropractor, and sometimes they make a real good adjustment in your spine, and that you feel a release in your whole spine. It's like everything is aligned again. So I felt this internal release just from reading that. And so I went back to the temple and I said, can I join? I want to join. I'm not going to fight for the US Army. That's all bogus. But I want to join Prabhupada's army, right? Well, you come, you come for a while and we'll see. They were testing, the sincerity. So I ended up going back to America and joining that summer in Boston.
Mm.
So, yeah.
So just a couple of weeks later, you basically joined the ashram there.
Well, it was, I arrived in Canada end of April, early May, 70. And then I went to the temple probably by late May. And now I stayed in Canada a little longer because what happened was I was a fugitive. I couldn't go back to the States because they had my number. There was a thing called a draft lottery. Mm. And if your name and number came up, then you had to go. And I didn't go. Instead, I went to Canada. So, so I wrote my draft board. They called draft boards in Stamford, Connecticut, where I grew up. And I said, oh, I'm in Canada. I've seen the error of my ways. I want to fight for my country. I just need fresh legal papers so I can get across the border legally. Oh, this is great. Come on home. Here are your papers. It was just a trick so I could get back into the country legally and, enjoy the movement. So I joined in Boston because I'm from New England, from Connecticut, which is near Massachusetts. And in July, probably about the second week, mid-July, 1970.
Mm. Do you remember what was the culture of reading at that time? I mean, there were not so many books available, but and how did Srila Prabhupada's books then help you to grow in Krishna consciousness in these early days?
Yeah. Well, interestingly enough, where I joined in Boston, it was, Prabhupada in 1970 in July, just, that month, he actually did form on paper the BBT. He incorporated the BBT, and he also formed the GBC to protect his movement, because his movement was being threatened by some jealous people in India. So he formed the GBC, fully 7 years before his own departure, so that ISKCON would continue after his leaving. So, and then he separately incorporated the BBT, because what happened when the Gaudiya Math fragmented during all the litigation and the disgrace, the breakup of the unified Gaudiya mission, one of the parties actually sold Bhaktisiddhanta's press, Calcutta Press. And that was, so Prabhupada was determined that what happened to his own Guru Maharaj's mission not happen to ISKCON. So he formed a GBC to help ISKCON continue, but God forbid if anything should happen to ISKCON, at least there would be a publishing house that would continue to publish the books. So, but that wasn't functioning really until 72. That was just on paper. So before then, there was something called ISKCON Press, if you've ever seen vintage publications. So where I joined in Boston, that's where ISKCON Press was.
Oh.
So I had the good fortune to be in the company of all these amazing devotees who constituted ISKCON Press. I mean, Satsaru Das Adhikari, he was the temple, he was married to Jadharani, the artist. He was a temple president. Jadharani was his wife. And then Hridayananda Brahmachari had just come from Berkeley. He was the temple commander. And then when Giriraj Maharaj was called to India, along with a bunch of others to help Prabhupada launch ISKCON in India, then Hridayananda assumed that role too. He was such a powerhouse. So, the famous artists, Bharadraj, Parikshit, Muralidhar, and my god sister Rukmini, who was Bharadraj's wife. She was there. Some more artists. Anyway, that was actually the de facto kind of hub of ISKCON at the time, because that's where all the artists and the editors and Pradyumna Prabhu, the Sanskrit editor, was there. And then the press workers who were actually, they had a press. I forget the name of it. One of these offset presses. I mean, it's extinct now, but it's, and they were producing the books. So I got in Jayadwaita Brahmachari, the first thing that happened to me as I approached the Boston Temple, the old Boston Temple, which typical early ISKCON temple, had been a funeral parlor. Anywhere where the wicked, they could get it cheap, right? A former funeral parlor. It wasn't set in such a nice part of town. Because there wasn't any money in those days, hardly. So as I approached, this is really kind of prophetic, because he was sitting outside in the front yard, and I was just a hippie with a headband and long hair and the backpack on my back, and I had a Gita, I had some beads in a paper bag, because in Toronto they didn't have any string for the beads, so they just sold me 108 loose beads in a paper bag. So anyway, Jayadwaita Brahmachari sits me down. He says, "Oh, welcome. Like pilgrim, your search has ended," something like that kind of mood. So he sits me down in a chair across from him, and he goes, "Now, I have 2 manuscripts here. Now you take this copy, and I'm going to keep this copy, and you just read at the top of your voice, as fast as you can, everything that you're seeing on the page." And it was volume 2 of the Krishna book.
Mm-hmm.
volume 1 had come out. Now, volume 2 was in production. And so he said, read this. Just don't stop for paragraph or sentences or spelling or punctuation. Just read as fast as you can. I just want to make sure all the words that I have, you have. So these copies are identical. And it was Narada Muni visiting Krishna in all his palaces. and Krishna's doing a different thing in all his palaces. So it was like a very kind of psychedelic introduction to Krishna consciousness. It was, doing all these amazing things and 5 billion bodyguards in this play in Dwarka. So and then I ended up, later on actually working for the BBT, but that's kind of later.
Mm.
So in those days there weren't many books at all. There was just the original Indian Bhagavatams that Prabhupada brought from India, and there were some vintage copies of those floating around. And then ISKCON Press was producing, because what Prabhupada had brought was the first canto. So we were producing the second canto in paperback chapters, like Answers by Citing the Lord's Version. Bhagavatam is the answer, the Lord in the Heart, all these, what we know as chapters now in the Bhagavatam second canto, they were just individual paperback books. So we were producing those. And then there was the Macmillan Gita. And, that was it. And just the week I joined, they had just started the morning program. So the morning program, that was an adjustment, from loosey-goosey hippie days, to getting up at 3:34 in the morning. That was a challenge, So morning program, Mangal Arati, they had just started this Mangal Arati and Japa and Tulsi Puja and then, and Bhagavatam. So the Bhagavatam class was usually Satsvarup Prabhu in those days. And he was reading from the first canto of the Indian Bhagavatams. So I'll tell you, the real thing that helped me sort of grow my Krishna consciousness was in 2 years later, when I was living in New Vrindavan, and actually I wasn't living there, I was just visiting there. I came for the Bhagavad Dharma Discourse Festival, famous festival. And right at that time, a month before that festival, Macmillan had finally come out with a complete unabridged Gita, what we know as the Macmillan Gita now, big fat Macmillan Gita. So still full of mistakes, but at least it was, complete. It was at least all the purports were there, and still, a lot of mistakes. But so anyway, we're all like in ecstasy, just having that in our hands. So I think I bought a copy at New Vrindavan, because I didn't have it until it came out in July, 4th of July. They handed that to Prabhupada. He was visiting the New York temple. And then in September, it was last week of August, first week of September, was Bhagavad Dharma Discourses. And so after the whole festival was over, no, it was on Prabhupada's Vyasa Puja day. I remember that now, because it was auspicious day. And after the Vyasa Puja festival, I went on a hillside at Bahulaban, one of the farms at New Vrindavan, and I opened it up and I made a vow, a vrat, because I realized after 2 years in the movement, I joined in July 70, now it's, August or September 72. I realized that actually there's so many great souls in this movement, but we're all pretty new. I mean, the movement was 6 years old at that time. The oldest devotee was a 6-year devotee. No one really knows what's going on. I realized that, except Srila Prabhupada. And we all had kind of inklings, more or less, what's going on here, philosophically and culturally, and every way you can think, organizationally. So I made a vrat. Okay, I may not be able to understand everything in this book, Bhagavad Gita, but I'm gonna memorize at least the verses. English and Sanskrit. And that'll help me. That'll give me an anchor, a kind of philosophical anchor. And I was a brahmachari in those days. I was a young brahmachari. And that'll give me kind of a center for my sadhana. So I developed this system. It wasn't like a New Year's resolution where you make a resolution and then it's gone in a month. You can't keep it up. I actually, somehow or other, because the Gita, I think maybe it came from the fact of what happened to me in Toronto 2 years earlier. The Gita had saved me from a kind of madness, this existential madness of nothing making sense. So it made a big impression on me. And then when it came out in a complete edition, kind of as a shelter and an act of gratitude, I just wanted to memorize these verses. And it was 700 verses, but that's doable, So it took me 6 years. I developed a system. This is before, phones and everything. So I just used index cards. And every day, when it was time to move ahead for a new verse, I would write, I started with the first verse, Dhritarashtra Uvacha Dharma Kshetra Kurukshetra. So I developed a system. I put on the lined side of the index card, because there was a lined side and then the blank side, 3 by 5, so it'd fit in your shirt pocket. I put the Sanskrit in the transliterated Sanskrit in blue, and then right below each word, I'd put in red pen the English translation of each word. Mm-hmm. So it was Sanskrit, transliterated Sanskrit and English. Then on the other side, I put the translation, and then I put it in my pocket. And that verse, whatever verse I was working on, became my kind of theme while I was learning it. And I knew I knew I could move on to the next verse when, no matter what time of day it was, what mood I was in, I could recite the Sanskrit and English. Boom, just like that. I wouldn't have to dredge my memory. It took, on an average, about 3 days. And then every Sunday, I would review the verses I'd learned. And then as I learned more chapters, I would rotate the chapters that I was learning. In this way, I kept it up. So, yeah, the Gita became the center of my reading. And I'm glad I did that, because to this day, the Gita is our foundational text. Even in Anchalila CC, Prabhupada's quoting Gita verses. He always brings us down to earth, no matter how lofty the subjects are. He's grounding us in the ABCs.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. I think it's so powerful to, learn shlokas, and as you mentioned, like, carry the meaning of the shloka with you, take it as a meditation. Yeah.
Yes.
In preparation of this interview, you also mentioned about how sometimes Srila Prabhupada's books can help one from danger. Would you like to share that with us? How it happened in your case?
Yeah. Well, there's different ways to answer that, but I'll tell you, by the time I got to Los Angeles, because my service took me to different places, and after 5 years in the Hare Krishna movement, by 1975, I knew that actually, because I was distributing books like so many of us, because Prabhupada was pushing that, but I knew that actually my calling was more working on the books, because Prabhupada was still dictating the books. And in LA, that was the first BBT branch. It was in LA, the North, it was just called the BBT. That was the only BBT in those days. So I decided to go out to the West Coast and somehow participate in the production of the books. And as Krishna would have it, I got there in January 76, and the indexer, the fellow who was indexing the books, who actually pioneered how to index Prabhupada's books, I mean, indexing, of course, was an old skill, but this devotee named Akshobhya, he was the one who learned how to index himself, and then he applied it to making indexes for Prabhupada's books. So he was doing the indexes. Let's see what was coming out then. He had just finished his 6th canto by 76, and then I arrived, and the general manager of the BBT, Radha Ballabha Prabhu, said, "Oh, you want to work at the BBT? So I'll tell you what, go find Akshobhya, because he wants to go out to Hawaii and do long-term indexing projects. Like, there was no index at that point for the Krishna book, and there was no index for the Nectar of Devotion. So those were very important books, but they didn't have any indexes. And Prabhupada actually said to the BBT, the indexes must be there, because scholars, Prabhupada was writing for devotees, but also for scholars. The scholars won't think our books are very prestigious unless they have indexes, because that's what they need. And also we need it too. If you close the book, then where's the reference? You needed some way to look it up. So Akshobhya, he taught me how to index, and then he went to Hawaii after a month, and then I became the main indexer, the workhorse on the production line. But it was wonderful, because I got to learn as I earned, so to speak, the philosophy even more, because it's a reading comprehension skill. The copy would come down, the Prabhupada would dictate, and then it would be transcribed. And then the proofreader would get a copy, I would get a copy, or the editor, he would, Jayadwara at that point, brahmachari still, he would get it. So and then he would be back and forth with Prabhupada, asking Prabhupada questions to clarify things. And then Devamrita, whom you know as Devamrita Maharaj, based in New Zealand, he was a brahmachari, and he was my roommate. And so he was the proofreader, and I was the indexer. I was the caboose at the end of the train. So I had to read the copy, and because I was the last person on the production line, they were always saying, "Hurry up! We want to produce these books, right?" Because the previous year was a famous 17 books in 2 months thing, where Prabhupada insisted we keep up with him, and we were. So now we wanted to keep going with that. So it was and there was no computer program in those days for indexing. I used index cards and a typewriter, and a slot full of A, B, C, D, E to sort them. But it was great, because I was learning, Prabhupada's books. It was a reading comprehension skill. And also, I was seeing because Prabhupada, he would present things from many angles in his books. So, for example, here's a good example of that. So at the end of the 7th canto, there's a very heavy purport where Prabhupada's talking about the perfect society. It's called, I think, the chapter, and he's talking about the 4 varnas and the 4 ashrams. And he talks about, there's a word in a verse, vantashi. Vantashi means one who eats his own vomit. And it's the idea of, if somebody takes up the sannyas order, and then he goes back to grihastha life, it's like having vomited out something unwanted and then eating your own vomit. It's so heavy. It's right in the verse. And so, and in ISKCON, very, very often, things that were going on while Prabhupada was dictating in ISKCON, Prabhupada would incorporate it into his purports. Sometimes you can read this. Current events in ISKCON make their way into Prabhupada's purports. So without making a direct reference, to embarrass the person, Prabhupada had recently received the resignation of a very prominent sannyasi in the movement, who just couldn't, maintain sannyas, because Prabhupada had given young men sannyas, And Prabhupada had even told some of those young men, at least one I know, because the young man said to Prabhupada when Prabhupada gave him sannyas, Srila Prabhupada, I don't know if I could do this my whole life. And Prabhupada said, that's okay. This is an emergency. So this is called battlefield commission. That, on the battlefield, there's going to be casualties. And sometimes you, even if you're not, you haven't, worked your way up through the ranks, but on the battlefield, sometimes you have to be appointed the next leader because somebody needs to lead. Just like in Kurukshetra, so many, first Bhishma led, and Bhishma fell, and then Drona went, and so like that. So there were casualties, and so this sannyasi resigned, and then Prabhupada said, it's a disgrace in his purport when this happens, and this is confirmed by this word in the verse. It's like eating your own vomit. So that's the end of the 7th canto, right? And then the 7th canto ends, and then you have the 8th canto with Gajendra Leela. Then you have the famous purport there, where the Leela is Gajendra, he's losing to the crocodile. I mean, an elephant can beat a crocodile on land any day of the week, but Gajendra was out of his element. He was in the water. He was in the crocodile's element. So then Prabhupada takes the opportunity of that Leela to offer the rose. Before it was the thunder. This is like eating vomit. And now he's offering the rose by saying, now, if one finds himself unable to continue in the sannyas ashram, this is right in the purport. I mean, following very close on the heels of the Vantashi purport. If one unable to do that, then he can take up the Grihastha ashram. He can do that. You can go to the Grihastha ashram. Don't give up the fight. That was, the fight against delusion. Don't give up your Krishna consciousness. So that was very heartening and encouraging for people who had been able to maintain their sannyas. There's his divine grace saying, okay, go to the Grihastha ashram and just pray to Krishna and he'll save you. And just like Gajendra was saved by remembering, from a previous life, Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. So that was very interesting to read that. And that was my kind of introduction, because as beginners, we tend to want everything to be black and white. It's either this or it's that. It's not like that. We're all at different points on the bhakti marg, on the spectrum of going back to Godhead. So Prabhupada is introducing a nuance there. And we should be compassionate like that, first with ourselves and then with others. Not that if we can't, come up to the highest level that it's hopeless. No, not like that. So that was a good introduction to the nuanced, the nuances of Prabhupada books. And of course, things get even more nuanced when you read Prabhupada's letters. Because in the books, very often you read Prabhupada's establishing the principles in the books, because that's philosophy, right? And then you have the letters, and boy, the way Prabhupada applies the philosophy to individuals in his letters are very, very eye-opening, very nuanced, very personal, very encouraging. The target is still there. It's not that Prabhupada is compromising the philosophy, but he's applying it in a way that people can do from where they're at, and he's encouraging them to go further. Yeah. Let's see.
Yeah.
So, saving from danger. I didn't get to that quite yet. You asked about that, right?
Yeah, you mentioned about the indexing at the BBT. That was interesting to hear that.
Yeah.
You didn't mention about the
danger. Well, I'll tell you, when I first got to LA in January 76, I got kind of distracted by another thing. But when I got to LA, it wasn't so many months since the 17 books in 2 months marathon had ended. I mean, it was insane. If everybody knows, most people know the history of Prabhupada dropping that bomb on a morning walk at Venice Beach, and then Radha Vallabh and Ramaswara Maharaj saying, this is impossible. And then Prabhupada famously saying, impossible is a word in a fool's dictionary.
Right.
And then, anyway, so they did it. Where there's a will, there's a way. Now, so just a few months later, I landed. And when I landed at the BBT, in January 70, I did notice that because that famous marathon had just happened, everybody in the BBT was still kind of talking in hushed tones about the rush. That's what they call the marathon, the rush, because it was a 24-hour thing. That's how they did it. Krishna gave Ramaswara and Radha Vallabh the intelligence to realize that if they did keep up production 24 hours and had the devotees going in shifts, that they could do this. And maybe it wouldn't be perfect, and it was full of mistakes. They even said to Prabhupada, there's a mistake, and Prabhupada said, fix it later. That was the mood. Fix it later. Yes, there's mistakes, but Prabhupada's priority was getting it out. He always told us, I don't know how much longer I have to live. And so to get it out. And so I arrived, and in the wake of the CC coming out, there was a group of BBT devotees, and they were reading the CC. They had helped produce it, but now they were, they had formed a study group. So as soon as I got to the BBT, I ran into one of the organizers of the study group, and he invited me to a CC reading. And I had heard the CC was out, but I hadn't even seen it. And so I thought, oh, this is nice. I can I'll work during the day on indexing, and then in the evening, for a little reading, I can attend this study group. Well, what did I find? As soon as I walked in, just as I was walking in to the room where there was a bunch of devotees, it was just for men, and then the ladies, the BBT ladies, they had their CC study group. So I heard somebody, I forget who, but he was bad-mouthing, or minimizing, I should say, minimizing the value of the Bhagavad Gita. I mean, this is the book that I'd been, let's see, it was 76 January. I was probably up to, the 13th chapter. Because it took me 6 years. So it was like I was probably around the 13th chapter. So that was saving me. That was the center of my sadhana. And I was really enlivened because now I was replacing all the garbage in my head, from previous lives, with all these beautiful Gita verses. They were like paintings in my mind, all these, I could just relate everything to Gita verses now. Still a lot of garbage there, but, I was gradually replacing the garbage with the Gita verses. So immediately when I heard this fellow say this, I thought it was a red flag. Like, what is he talking about? Who does he think he is? Who is this know-it-all, bad-mouthing, minimizing my Gita? I was owning the verses by trying to live them and share them and preach them. So I didn't like that at all. But I still entered, and I sat down just to see what was going to happen. Well, sure enough, what were they reading? They were just reading excerpts from the CC that had to do with Krishna's intimate pastimes with the gopis. And that's all they were doing. Because, this was the real nectar, Prabhu. The Gita, it's just ABC. It's just the three modes of material nature. And, this is the real nectar. So that's a whole pastime of what happened. Later on, Prabhupada came to town in June, and he smashed what we were. And that was the only time I went to that meeting, by the way. I left that meeting, and I thought, I'm never going back there again. These people they're out of their mind. They think they're just by reading Krishna's pastimes with the gopis, they're going to become gopis themselves. So, so as the months went on, before Prabhupada came to town in June for the showdown, we used to call that group and the lady counterpart the Gopi Baba Club, GBC. Only it was a caricature of the GBC. It wasn't the real GBC. Yeah. So Prabhupada's Gita saved me from the Gopi Baba Club. Otherwise, when Prabhupada came to town and heard about it and had a meeting in his room, I mean, Harishari Prabhu writes about this in one of his diaries because he was the personal servant then. Phew! It was a shootout. Prabhupada. The first thing Prabhupada said to these people, Prabhupada called them all to his room, along with all the visiting temple presidents, GBCs, sannyasis. He wanted to show, he wanted everybody to witness what he was about to do. He was about to exorcise a sahajya weed from the heart of his movement. Prabhupada called the BBT his heart. Iskha was his body, and the BBT was the heart. So the first thing Prabhupada says when they all sit down, he says to the people in the, especially the organizers of this study group, "Why are you jumping like monkeys?" That's how he opens it. He opens it with this cannon shot. But they're so smitten. They're so intoxicated with the idea that they're becoming like gopis that they start, "But Prabhupada, this is your books. Or Mahaprabhu said this is the topmost. But are you topmost? Why don't you read the part where Mahaprabhu says, 'My spiritual master found me to be a fool, unfit for anything but chanting Hare Krishna'? Why don't you read that part? First deserve, then desire." But Prabhupada, we're not reading anybody else. This is your books. And what else did they say? Yeah, but Prabhupada, this is your books. You told us to read your books. Prabhupada said, "Look, my books are like a drugstore." Prabhupada, of course, was intimately aware of Prabhupada was a pharmacist during his Grihastha years. "My books are like a drugstore. If you go to a pharmacy, a drugstore, you can't just go in and demand any old drug. You've got to have a prescription from your doctor for a medicine that's specific to your ailment. So my prescription for you is first Kurukshetra Lila, then Rasa Lila." So when I heard that, because I wasn't in the room, but a friend of mine who was in the room, he told me, I felt totally vindicated. I felt Prabhupada protected me, because I was memorizing the Gita. I knew something was fishy about this group. First deserve, then desire. First Kurukshetra, then Rasa Lila. So that was quite a lesson. Yeah. So that was a danger that Prabhupada and his Gita saved me from, of actually not being grounded. And I'll tell you, even after Prabhupada had that sort of shootout, they were trying to defend themselves. They were so intoxicated with the idea they were becoming gopis that they were arguing with Prabhupada. And they finally, stopped arguing, but only two people, and I won't mention names, but two people that I knew survived the Gopi Baba Club. Everybody else had very unfortunate ends. Either they were killed, or they blooped, left the movement, or they became just professional offenders. There's some devotees who think that their job is to blaspheme the devotees who have dedicated their lives for propagating the holy name of the Lord in the name of Prabhupada. So they publicly stopped the group, but they on their own, they kept going with that, and they met very unfortunate ends. Only a couple of fortunate souls who took Prabhupada's instruction to heart, because Prabhupada said, "Look, stop this. If you continue with this, you will ruin your spiritual life." And so, yeah.
Yeah, it's a very, very instructive story. Thank you for sharing.
Yeah,
Yeah.
boy.
Yeah. So when we look at your life later on, you also started to write for the Back to Godhead magazine, right?
Yeah, that was a
Was
real.
that was also inspired by Srila Prabhupada's books, or how do you?
Yeah, because all over Prabhupada's books, you'll find plain living and high thinking, varnashram. Varnashram is all over Prabhupada's books, but we don't necessarily recognize that because that's the phase of Prabhupada's movement we still haven't really, done. We've done, book. Well, I mean, even the fact that you're having this books are the basis is a testament to the fact that we still need to improve a lot, even in reading Prabhupada's books and studying Prabhupada's books. But I had the good fortune because after Prabhupada left our vision, of course, as we know, there's a lot of chaos in the movement, and Prabhupada even predicted that. In the fourth canto, there's a purport where when a great acharya leaves, then there's chaos, but his faithful disciples do what they can to set things right. So for most of the 80s, which is the heart of the chaos, which we're still recovering from, actually, I spent that at Prabhupada's second rural community. The first was New Vrindavan. That was in 68, 69. Prabhupada went there in 69 and blessed the project with his association. He was there for 6 weeks, stayed there a long time. And then New Vrindavan in the 70s, because Prabhupada gave New Vrindavan 2 very difficult mandates. He said, become, live in the lap of material nature, depend on Krishna, to become self-sufficient with land and cows. And at the same time, he asked Kirtanananda Maharaj to build 7 temples on 7 hills, just like 7 temples in, Vrindavan, India. But West Virginia is full of hills. It's mountain country. So those were very difficult things. So in the 70s, I spent about 1.5 years in New Vrindavan off and on, but it was so austere. I could never stay there during the winter. So I would stay there in the winter, and then I'd leave or stay there in the summer and leave in the winter. And Kirtanananda, he dubbed me Suresvara because I was just because I could only stay in the summer. But not just me. So many people, they just couldn't handle the rugged West Virginia mountain climate. So then he started actually building facilities. There was hardly any facilities there. It was very austere. And that's when he decided he was going to start, building more, like a temple for Radha Madhava Chandra, a proper temple. And if you go to New Vrindavan today, there is a nice temple and place there. So anyway, I couldn't handle it. So I went to Gita Nagari in 74, and it was more facility there. And excuse me, what am I saying? It wasn't 74. We're talking about in the 80s now. Yeah, in the 80s. I went to Gita Nagari in the 80s, where there was a mature Grihastha community. And Satsvarup Maharaj, he was kind of what was the zonal guru days. So he was the zonal guru. But he was, he was writing the Lilamrita. So I joined his team as a researcher. I kind of was still in my, BBT mode. So I joined him as a researcher for the first couple of volumes there for Lifetime in Preparation and Planting the Seed. And then my life changed. I had actually got married in 81. But luckily I was living in a place where there was a lot of mature householders who were giving me pointers, like Borijan Prabhu, one of ISKCON's best educators. He was living at Gita Nagari from 76 to early 80s. And Paramananda Prabhu and Gaur Hari, all these older householders, family people. So they helped me, get adjusted to Grihastha life. So that was a blessing. And of course, Satsrup Maharaj even though it was his own Acharya days, he wasn't getting in the way of our relationship with Prabhupada. He was giving us Prabhupada through his writings. So then Gita Nagari was doing great in those days. And it's doing well again in a different kind of reincarnation. But in those days, we were milking a lot of cows, working a lot of oxen, growing a lot of our own food. We were, doing plain living and high thinking in many ways. And so in BTG, it was in Southeast Pennsylvania, and BTG was being produced in those days in Philadelphia, at what they call the BTG house near the temple. So because they knew, some of the BTG people knew me. I had been writing for a publication called Brijbhasi Spirit, which was writing pieces about the old days at New Vrindavan. They liked my writing. So they said, hey, why don't you try writing for BTG? So I said, oh yeah, actually, I really like it here. I really felt at home there, maybe for the first time, because it was land and cows, and it was like living what we were talking about in the books and what we were preaching, distributing the books. So I said, okay. So I started writing pieces, and I started writing a column. The BTG people said, okay, we'll call it Simple Living and High Thinking. Mm. And so I was writing about what we were doing. And those were some of the best years. I mean, frankly, Prabhu, what I'm doing now is so much vital and appreciated all over the movement, the Founder Acharya seminars. But next to this, what I'm doing now, what I did then, writing for BTG, and inspiring people that, yeah, actually it's going on. There's some place where people are doing this. And I was getting letters from far and wide from people saying, yeah, this is wonderful, keep it up. And so that's where I kind of cut my teeth, so to speak, on learning how to write, just developing the writing, and really growing into the culture of Krishna consciousness, the way Krishna lives, living the way Krishna lives. So I wrote a lot of pieces, and I saved them. And to this day, when people meet me, like at Mayapur or somewhere, that's where they first saw me, in a younger edition, with overalls on. And
basically what we read in Srila Prabhupada's books about simple living, high thinking, you actually experienced there, and then you wrote it. Yeah.
Yeah, and I was communicating. It was fun.
You mentioned the Prabhupada Founder Acharya seminars that you prepared and then shared with the devotees. Maybe we should talk a little about that in connection with reading Prabhupada's books.
Mm-hmm. Right. Okay. Yeah. So, well, in the early 2000s, I was, so many things happened in my life. My marriage, by mutual understanding, my wife and I, we went our separate ways in 2000. And we have a daughter, and to this day, we're in touch through our daughter. And I mean, it's funny. When I went through, it was a divorce. In the West, it's called divorce. Jayadwada Maharaj said to me, "Yeah, they call it divorce in the West. In India, they call it vanaprastha." So don't think of it as something traumatic. So that helped me kind of understand it in a different light. But anyway, I ended up studying to sort of get a new lease on life, a new direction in life. Because, when you're married I was married for 20 years, 1981 to 2001. So it was really challenging, when the family kind of divided. it was challenging because when you are married, you begin to think that's who you are. I'm the husband of this person, and I'm the father of this girl, and you are in a relative duty sense. But then it's also easy to forget who you really are. You know, you're eternal servant of Krishna. And anyway, I got a new lease on life in 2008 when I went to Mayapur, and I discovered the Mayapur Institute.
So you studied, and you later on also started to
First, I studied. I took Bhakti Shastri at the ripe old age of whatever I was, 60 something. There was a few of us old guys. It was good. I took Bhakti Shastri, and then I started taking Bhakti Vaibhav, studying the Bhagavatam. And then I started teaching Bhakti Vaibhav. And so here's another thing where it was really good teaching, because there's an old saying in teaching, the one who learns the most is the teacher, because you have to be prepared. You have to have more knowledge and more experience, ideally, than your students. So if you've ever been to Mayapur and you've ever experienced these courses, people don't just go to these courses just to study, because Prabhupada's books are everywhere, all over the world, but what they're really looking for when they go to the VIHE or they go to the MI, they're looking for a transformation of their life. It's not everybody that is willing to set aside several months of their life to go through a semester at MI or VIHE just to study Prabhupada's books. It's not just because you're going to get a certificate, that I'm a Bhakti Shastra, I'm a Bhakti Vaibhav or whatever, Bhakti Vedanta. But they're really going to the Dham to do this because they want something more. Maybe they've come to a crossroads in their Krishna consciousness, as I had, and they want some transformative experience. So I quickly became aware of that in my own life. Certainly that was true for me. And then when I started teaching, I could see, yeah, this is what people are looking for. So as I was teaching, I was coming in contact with people from India and Europe and South America and North America. And I quickly became aware that they're hearing Srila Prabhupada in different ways because of the cultural filter they're bringing. I remember specifically thinking, this is when I was teaching the sixth canto. There was one of those really heavy statements, challenging statements where Prabhupada makes about women, right? Sensitive statements Prabhupada makes about women. And so there was a couple of Indian brahmacharis in the class, but there was also some very educated ladies from South America who were in the class. And they were really having a hard time with some of these statements. Where Prabhupada said, it is a fact that to do justice to it, I should get the exact quote, but the gist was, it is a fact that the intelligence of a man is always greater than the intelligence of a woman. And that's, number one, that's not our practical experience. Any man is always more intelligent than any woman. It's a very absolute statement, right? Of course, you have to balance those statements with other statements Prabhupada makes, and that's what I had to do. But the ladies in the class, as I was teaching, they're having a real hard time with it. And so to help them understand Prabhupada in context, I was bringing other statements Prabhupada made, which would balance those statements. And this went on. I remember we went through this, I think it was that section of the sixth canto, 617 or something, I forget, where it took a while for us to get through this. And at the end of the class, these brahmacharis, they would come to me, Indian brahmacharis, and they said, Prabhu, why are we spending so much time on this? It makes perfect sense to us, because they're coming from a very kind of traditional culture where maybe the Madhujis understand that their whole access to Krishna consciousness is through their Prabhuji, but it's totally different in the West. from the time they're toddlers, boys and girls are mixing and they're educated the same way, and the ladies are getting degrees and their PhDs and they're teaching. And so when I explained to them the cultural difference between East and West, is just as far as education was concerned, and why I had to spend more time with these ladies from South America who were very educated, and they weren't going to accept blindly what was being written or spoken. Then they got it. They said, "Oh, that's how they're raised, and that's how they think. And this is how." Okay, Prabhu, we understand. So take as much time as you want to help these ladies understand Prabhupada culturally. And of course, Prabhupada would say, I have favorite purports, CC 23, Madhya 23:105, Bhagavatam, Canto 4, 8, Chapter 8, Text 54, where Prabhupada talks about this, that the way you present Krishna consciousness is totally different in a place like India than, say, America. It really varies according to time, country, candidate. But it's such a challenge in Mayapur when you got the whole world coming to one place, and all the cultures are sitting in the same classroom sometimes. The Chinese are there, and the South Americans and the Indians and the Europeans. So we all have our cultural filters, and so we really have to understand Prabhupada. We have to come to some understanding of Prabhupada despite those cultural filters. So that's how, teaching helped me, because I had to be able to deal with that. I couldn't just take my cultural filter. I had to relate to traditional people, contemporary people, women, men, young, old. There's generational differences too, because even in India today, if you go to, Mumbai, the ladies are more like the ladies in the West in Mumbai than they are in the villages in India. India is changing. So.
And what made you start this Prabhupada Founder Acharya series? I mean, you certainly gained experience in teaching, but then at some point you started to focus on Prabhupada's.
Sure, yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, well, I was studying at the MI. I was teaching at the MI, and then I bumped into a committee. I didn't even know the committee existed. I didn't know what Gopal Bhatta Prabhu and Konteya Prabhu were up to with their SPT, Strategic Planning Team. But there was a committee, one committee in the Strategic Planning Team was called the Prabhupada's Position Committee. Mm-hmm. And I already had been kind of, even before I started researching Prabhupada's position as founder Acharya, I had already lived in India. There's a little backstory to this too. In the 90s, when our daughter was little, we had sold our house near Gita Nagari, and we had a daughter, and she was very young. She was 3. And so we had a dream of raising, and that's all it proved to be too, a dream. But we had a dream of raising our little girl, who was a Garbhadan girl, a 50-round girl, and she was very sweet and bright and had a great horoscope and all this stuff. So we said, oh, let's see if we can raise her in South India, where we know there's still some culture, traditional culture. So we went to South India, and we were at this community in Karnataka. It's still going on, Bhaktivedanta Eco Village, they call it now, I think. So we were there off and on. We were there for a couple of years. But where the tie-in with the founder Acharya is, we were about 2 to 3 hours by bus from Udupi, which is the home of the Madhva Sampradaya. So when I went to Udupi, I really, we were kind of recovering still from the zonal Acharya. It was the mid-90s, and the mid-80s was the peak of, zonal Acharya days. But we're still kind of recovering from that. And ISKCON is, to this day, it's not. It could be more founder Acharya centered. Diksha and Shiksha gurus are very important, but unless and until everybody understands that our core identity, our foundational relationship is with the founder Acharya, we won't be able to withstand the ravages of time. But the Madhvas and the Ramanujis get it. They've been going for centuries. And so I saw in Udupi how everybody was totally Madhva focused.
Mm.
And they loved their Diksha gurus. Why? And their Shiksha gurus? Because they were deepening, enriching, enhancing their core relationship with Madhva, their identity with Madhva. They were Madhvites. And so, when I saw that, I thought, wow, this is how it's got to be in ISKCON. We've got to deepen everybody's relationship with Srila Prabhupada. No matter what God family we're in, no matter what part of the world we're in, no matter who our Diksha and Shiksha gurus are, we've got to, if we want unity, we got diversity, but we need more unity. And the founder Acharya provides it. And that's how they survived over the centuries. So this is what we need. So when I went to Mayapur in 2003, and I saw the late, great Bhakti Charu Maharaj there, and I knew he was talking a lot about founder Acharya. So as soon as I saw him, I bowed down and I said, Maharaj, can you teach a seminar on Srila Prabhupada's position as founder Acharya? This is before I ever dreamed of doing one. So he said, in his typical Bhakti Charu Maharaj way, loving way and empowering way, he said, let's teach it together. He said this to me. And I said, what? Well, okay, if you want, I'll be in the room with you, and maybe I'll ask you questions. And that's actually what happened. I ended up feeding him questions, So that was kind of the seed of what became my seminar series. And then in 2011, when I realized that there's a whole committee dedicated to putting Prabhupada more in the center in a very solid, long-term way, I went to a meeting, and Bhakti Charu was the co-chair, and he said, "Oh, Suresvara Prabhu, here's what Yadabar. He started thinking about a movie now, because they were thinking about what are we going to do to help ISKCON for the upcoming 50th anniversary of ISKCON and Prabhupada's coming to the West." And so Yadabar was started to make a movie, and Vishnu Murti, he started thinking about Vanipedia. That was just the beginning. And Hari Shari, he was still traveling the world with his Prabhupada Living Bhagavad series. There's a lot of heavy hitters there, a lot of wonderful devotees who were doing things. And we were all on a committee. And Ravindra Sarup was there. He was the writer, and he was the one who actually came out with a booklet that we published in 2014. He was the main writer after we, put him through his paces with editing. It had reached in 2014 a point where it was ready to be published. The GBC thought it was ready. So it was Bhakti Charu Maharaj who encouraged. So I said, well, you're all doing this. I want to make a seminar series about how we can deepen our relationship with Prabhupada, deepen our commitment to his mission, deepen our love for him. And so Bhakti Charu Maharaj just lit up. He said, please do this. And he became my main cheerleader. And it was his empowerment. It was his, that's how he was. He was always like that. That inspired me to go back. I was based in Hawaii at that time. After the family had split up, I had moved far away to Hawaii, got a new life there. And I was, I was distributing books. I went back to book distribution. And I was researching these seminars. And then I started testing them that fall in 2011. And they just keep, and I since the pandemic, I've been teaching them on Zoom. So just doing the research, I have a couple of notes here because so how did Prabhupada's books play into this? Well, they played a big part. For example, the first lesson in the seminar, it's called the Sambandha lessons, where we deepen our relationship with Prabhupada. I took the title of the first lesson, The Spiritual Masters, right from CC. That's the name of the first chapter of CC, Adi Lila, The Spiritual Masters. So here's an example. So Prabhupada makes many statements about Shiksha and Diksha gurus in that first chapter. For example, quote, "There is no difference between the shelter-giving Supreme Lord and the initiating and instructing spiritual masters." We still place more emphasis on the initiator than the instructor, but philosophically, there's no difference. And then Prabhupada takes it to a level further. He says, if one foolishly discriminates between them, saying one is higher, one is lower, he commits an offense in the discharge of devotional service. So we really need to build up this Shiksha culture more. The initiator is so important. He's the formal connector to the parampara. But Shiksha Guru, what does Kaviraj Goswami say? He says, I have one initiating spiritual master, and I can have unlimited spiritual masters. And at the end of every chapter, he offers obeisances to his Shiksha gurus. His Lord Nityananda is his Diksha guru, and his initiating gurus are Rupa Raghunath, who are always, instructing him about Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, and he became the definitive biographer. So how important are the Shiksha gurus? And then here's a famous one. Prabhupada writes in that was CC Adi 147 purport, what I just read before. This is CC Adi 135, quote, "A devotee must have only one initiating spiritual master because in the scriptures, acceptance of more than one is always forbidden. There is no limit, however, to the number of instructing spiritual masters one may accept." And then Prabhupada says, famously, "Generally, a spiritual master who constantly instructs a disciple in spiritual science becomes his initiating spiritual master later on." So that's the kind of guru-disciple culture Prabhupada wants, local. So then I made a note, to help make ISKCON's guru-disciple culture more local, more Founder-Acharya-centered, we need to pay more attention to Srila Prabhupada's Bhaktivedanta purports, which he called his spiritual ecstasies. And then we'll do what we'll develop more of Varnashram, we'll develop more of the kind of guru-disciple culture he wants. We'll read his books more. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a very pragmatic example how by reading Srila Prabhupada's books, we really understand Prabhupada much better, what he actually wanted. Yeah.
What he wanted. Yeah, our problems come because we forget. He would tell us, my only criticism of you people, this is in the mid-70s, you don't read my books. You think they're just for selling. I'm writing he's writing them for the whole world, but he's especially writing them for people who are trying to follow him. And he, in one really foreboding letter, ominous letter, he also said, if you don't study all of my books, the day will come when there will be no more Hari Hari Bol, as happened in the Gaudiya Math. There will be no more, cooperative, united mission. Yeah, so important. So thanks for doing this.
Thank you for sharing all these insights. I think it was very wonderful. Was a lot of historical description, and we got a lot of insights in, more than 50 years of practice of Krishna consciousness. It's a lot of insights on ISKCON history also we got from this interview. So thank you so much, Prabhu. Do you have any final thoughts or messages you want to share with our viewers before we end the interview?
So the whole thrust of your committee is how to inspire people, how to motivate ourselves to read Prabhupada's books, and how to inspire others to create this culture of reading Prabhupada's books, as we see so wonderfully with Keshava Bharati Maharaj and by Sheshika Prabhu, for example.
And I think also from your life, what we just heard, I found it was very inspiring that throughout your life, Srila Prabhupada's books always played a very important role. So that's very inspiring. Yeah.
Well, I don't think I'd be here talking to you if I didn't read Prabhupada's books. I would have been another casualty. Let's see. You know, it's funny when I teach these seminars, even on Zoom, even virtually, then after they're done, the series is done. You know, we do the Sambandha lessons, the Abhideya lessons, the Prayoja lessons. And then inevitably, the same question comes up. Suresvara Prabhu, what do we do now? Now that, you know, you've kind of reminded us or awakened us to our relationship with Srila Prabhupada, that we should be cultivating, you know, developing. What do we do? So I always encourage them. I say, I made a note here. I say, finding even one devotee who shares your passion to hear from and about Srila Prabhupada can make all the difference in your desire to understand and apply Srila Prabhupada's books in a mature, balanced way. Because it's a big deal now. It's a very, it's kind of a buzzword. You know, this word hermeneutics is coming up a lot. And hermeneutics means the art and science of interpretation. So that's now being used in connection with Prabhupada's books, because Prabhupada makes a lot of statement in his books that can be construed as being very controversial. So it doesn't have to be, we have to study just those kind of statements. But I always encourage people, if you want to understand Prabhupada's books better, understand Prabhupada better. And Prabhupada authorized Satsrup Maharaj and also authorized Yadavar Prabhu with a movie and Satsrup Maharaj with a biography, if they could do it properly, which they have done wonderfully. To get to know Prabhupada's life, to get to know the person, Prabhupada. Because if we just, here's the counter challenge to studying his books, you know, reading Prabhupada's books. If we just do that, if we just read his books and we don't understand the person, Prabhupada, who wrote those books and how he applied what he's teaching in his own life and in our lives, it can get impersonal. You can just think of Prabhupada as a kind of principle instead of a person, or like a face on a mountain. You know, like in America, we have Mount Rushmore, where the presidents in South Dakota, they're carved in the. But Prabhupada was the writer of the books. And he did say, if you want to know me, read my books. But how he applied those books in his own life and in the lives of his followers, get to know that too. And so there were so many books by Prabhupada. It's a whole life's work. Yeah, I'm looking at them now. I'm looking at it's a library that Prabhupada gave us. And then I have that on one shelf, and then on another shelf, I have books about Prabhupada, and there's more and more. So many wonderful books about Prabhupada from people who, you know, were there when Prabhupada walked among us. So do both. And then it's even hard to do that on your own. So it's easier to do it if you have a Sangha. So if you can find, as I say, even one devotee who shares your passion to hear from him and about him, that can make all the difference in your desire to understand and apply Prabhupada's books in a mature, balanced way. That's where the hermeneutics comes in. Because as you go deeper into Prabhupada's books, unless we understand Prabhupada's spoken word and written word in a mature, balanced way, we can become very bewildered by the apparent contradictions in his Vani. Yeah, so that's very important. So find your Prabhupada mate, your study mate, and that will help you stay enlivened. I have here in Tucson, in the desert, I found my study mate. And even though I'm teaching this, I need my study mate. because it's all these, and we're studying about Prabhupada now, all these wonderful books that are coming out, and it's just so many insights. It's just unlimited. All right, Prabhu.
Wonderful. I think that's a wonderful closing, that understanding Prabhupada through his books, but also through his life and his example that he gave.
Yes.
And study that together in the Association of Devotees.
Aye.
Thank you so much, Prabhu.
Thank you.
Your time and sharing with us your insights. Hare Krishna, Srila Prabhupada ki jai.
Srila Prabhupada ki jai.
Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama.